Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How's your garden doing? How would you kind of rate the growing season so far?
We're at 10 out of 10. I mean,
midpoint.
We've been in the house for 7 years, and so this has been, 6. I think Sam has really started early on, but I would say 6 years of us really doing some projects. The first year was just kind of like figuring out what we had, adding a couple things. But this by far has been the best working conditions and the most rewarding, because a lot of the stuff that we planted was planted 3 or 4 years ago.
So it's kind of coming into their own, yeah.
To the point now where we're going to have to divide some stuff, to divide and move some things. If the only thing this year is that we've gotten so much moisture that sometimes it's hard to if you want to move something, or we're looking at digging up some sections of lawn, we kind of have to wait until it dries out a little bit. Yeah, a little wet.
It is. And you mentioned the working conditions. Yeah, I've enjoyed not having these long stretches of 90 degrees heat and humidity. So just working outside is a little more pleasant this year. And so, yeah, I'd echo that too. I'd say 10 out of 10, except our vegetable garden. I'm afraid my watermelons are maybe a 1 out of 10 because they've wanted heat. And of course, our garden kind of at the back of our area where water drains, it was too wet. I didn't get anything planted until after the first week in June, I think it was. And we haven't had the heat that the watermelons like, but you can't have everything.
Right.
And I'd rather have my lawn nice and rich green. I'd rather have my perennials well hydrated. And so, yeah, I can do, even if I don't get a watermelon this year, well, that's what the farmers markets are for too.
Yeah, last year was a great year for us for tomatoes and peppers.
They love the non-ending heat, that's for sure.
And this year, the bushes are growing well, but I think the fruits are coming along. But it's a different. There's always challenges.
There are, and of course that's what we're going to talk about today. Kind of the middle of the summer, we start seeing some of these challenges kind of pop up, and many of these are cyclical. They tend to rear up each year. But, I love the saying, forewarned is forearmed. If you kind of can look for some of these things, well, then at the start of them, is there something we can do to deal with them? So
what are the ones that you hear most about? Like, let's start. Like, what are some of the things that people are most concerned about, the challenges that are coming up that people have?
Well, my 3 most frequently asked questions overall is, number 1, blossom end rot on tomatoes. Where the bottom of the tomato is all brown and sunken. And then of course rabbit control in the yards and gardens. And why isn't my autumn blaze maple doing well? So I mean, overall, those are the questions that I get most frequently. So it's going to be interesting to should we start off with maybe insects that are chewing?
That's the thing. I've noticed like a sweet potato vine in front. We've got insects have chewed it up, and it hasn't been a bad year for mosquitoes. So you may not be thinking, at least where I am, we haven't had a lot of mosquitoes. So it hasn't seemed like a bad year for insects, but we are finding them in the garden.
Yeah. Now you mentioned, was it sweet potato vine where you're noticing
the greens?
Some holes? Yeah. Do you see any insect on them? I'm curious.
I haven't. They're on a window box, so I can't get as close.
That's very common because I noticed my own sweet potato vine. It's got holes in.
Yep.
Our rose leaves have some holes in. We'll talk about roses more and their insects. Our string beans, the leaves have some holes in, and some of our shrubbery have holes in. It's interesting. On all of those things that I'm seeing holes on, I rarely see the insect eating them.
Okay.
And so that can make it a little tricky, but there are 3 or 4 products that it helps to have on your shelf for treating insects. You don't need to have all 3 or 4, but the insecticides that I'm going to mention are considered broad spectrum. That means when you look at the label, they control quite a few different insects. And so even if we don't specifically see what insect it is eating, and of course that's the preferred, try to, catch the villain in the act so you can identify it. But these insecticides are broad spectrum enough that they're going to, the label is going to have most of the things that we're needing to treat for. So those products, one is good old malathion.
Okay.
Have you ever used malathion? I hate the smell of it.
Oh.
Malathion's been around forever, but it really smells. I don't like the smell of it. But malathion is a good one, good insecticide. Sevin. Sevin's been around ever since I was
Sevin,
born.
just the number?
Sevin.
Okay.
Yep. Sevin, like the number, except spelled out without an E at the end. Sevin. A relatively new one is called 8. EIGHT.
Okay.
So when you are at garden centers or hardware stores and looking at their insect control products, you'll see 7 and 8. I like to say I'm waiting for 9 to come out because that's really going to be something.
Top of the line.
Yes. And another one that's just an awesome insecticide is called spinosad. SPINOSAD.
We talked that along with apples trees,
yes,
right?
It's an organic product that was found on a tropical island by an old rum distillery. They found that the insects just were not there where they were just a little ways down the beach. And so a soil scientist noticed that and isolated the bacteria from that soil area, and they derived this product called spinosad that is a good insecticide. And so it's cleared for organic type use also. So that's a great one. And so between all of those, malathion, 7, 8, spinosad, those will handle almost anything. But even 2 of those, I like to keep spinosad on hand and then maybe one of the others.
How do you apply them?
And good question. Now, I believe all of those, other than malathion, malathion is, I believe, only a liquid concentrate, but 7, 8, and spinosad are either dusts, powders that you dust on, or a liquid concentrate. There may be ready-to-use ones too, but I like to keep the concentrate on hand because you're going to get more for your money that way.
Okay.
And so I use a 2-gallon pump-type sprayer, and the label will tell how much to add, how many ounces or tablespoons to add to a gallon of water. So then I mix up a gallon or 2 gallons and then spray the concentrate on. I found that's a little more effective than the dust. The dust, if you want a quick application and don't want to mix anything up, then the powders can be used. But like dusting cabbage and stuff, then you kind of have that residue on, and the sprays are a little less visible, and you can get good coverage with the spray. You can direct the spray to the underside of the leaf as well as the top. So the spray type gives you, I think, a little better coverage.
That's what I was going to ask. For something like this, for these insecticides, do we want to be spraying the foliage as opposed to like when we're fertilizing? You want to spray or you want to get the fertilizer in on the right around the base of the plant, right?
So
you want to get the dirt, you want to get the soil.
So we want to get good coverage on both the upper side of the leaf and the lower side, the stems, and a little bit around the plant itself. And it's important to follow the label directions as to how often. One nice thing about these products too, okay, as we were mentioning coverage, okay, so you get the leaves. What about if it's something that's starting to bear fruit already, like tomatoes that you've got something nibbling on the leaves, or if it's raspberries and they're going to come into bearing? Look on the label for what is called the pre-harvest interval. That's the interval between the time you spray and the time it's safe to harvest. All these insecticides have a different breakdown rate. Some are more persistent, meaning the time between the time you spray and the time it's safe to eat those products is going to be longer. Malathion and spinosad both have a very short interval, meaning if the raspberries are going to start coming into bearing and you need to handle some insects that are on those, you can spray those, check the label, but there may be only 2 days between the time you spray and the time it's safe to eat. And so follow the label directions, but check that harvest interval too. So some of these products, very important to always follow the label. That's the best guide.
All right. What about some trees and shrubs?
Yeah,
There's
so
some.
some of the things that we should be looking out for. Now, in trees, a common question that we get in photos are of a big web. Have you ever seen those? The tent caterpillar up
Yeah.
in trees, fruit trees, flowering crab apples, some shade trees. There will be this big webbing, this massive webbing kind of a nest, and some fairly good sized caterpillars crawling around in there. Those are the tent caterpillars. And if you can just on that branch, hopefully it's a little branch, where there's that nest, when all the caterpillars are in there, such as towards evening, just cut off that and dispose of it, enclose it in a plastic bag, throw it in the outgoing trash. If the caterpillars are out of the nest and crawling around, then you could use one of the insecticides that we mentioned, labeled for tent caterpillars, such as the 7-8 malathion spinosad. Another thing that a person can do is if it's up a little ways into the tree and you can't quite reach to prune it out, then with a pole or a stick, with maybe a wire attached onto the end, just reach up and kind of do some twisting motion, and you can oftentimes get that webbed nest to stick to your pole.
Okay.
Maybe screw a couple of screws on the end, something that'll grab that nest and pull it on out with the insects, caterpillars still inside. So next, let's talk about roses.
Yeah.
Roses can be attacked.
You've
now,
seen some.
Yeah. It's fairly common in the first part of the growing season to have, especially the lower leaves, attacked, and you'll see lots of little holes. It's called the rose pear sawfly. And you rarely see it. It's a little tiny, kind of a squishy little green insect that works. Most of its work is invisible until you see the holes, and it just causes shot holes all over the lower leaves on the rose. So again, one of the insecticides that we mentioned. The good news is that the last half of the summer, that insect has gone on to a different life cycle.
Okay.
So the newer growth is usually free of that problem. But when you first start earlier in the season, start seeing holes in the leaves of your roses, treat, because that can almost skeletonize a rose bush, and then it's going to look pretty tough for the rest of the season until new growth comes along. And of course, vegetable gardens. Vegetable gardens are easy prey for insects. Cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli are attacked by the green cabbage worm.
Okay.
And so important to treat for those. Those are the larvae stage of the white butterflies. Sometimes they're yellow. So if you see the white butterflies flitting around the cabbage patch, they're going to lay eggs that turn into the green larvae that cause all the holes in your cabbage. And it's really unappetizing to pick a broccoli and get it ready to cook and then find a green worm kind of in between. So really unappetizing. So there is one insecticide that is kind of specifically for caterpillars. And so this is a good one too that we didn't mention with the others. It's called BT. B as in boy, T as in Tom. That's short for Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a beneficial bacteria that is kind of specific to larvae type insects, such as the cabbage loopers. And the nice thing about that is you can thoroughly treat your cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli with that when the little cabbage worms are small yet. And since that's just a beneficial bacteria that only attacks little caterpillars, it doesn't harm humans. So you don't have that residue. So that's a popular product for many organic people too. And other things in the vegetable garden, make sure your string beans, as I mentioned, our string beans oftentimes get little holes in. And so when you see the first holes being formed, time to go and treat.
How about with radishes? Sometimes Sam likes radishes. She's planted radishes and was disappointed. They got kind of eaten up a couple of years ago.
Yeah, with a bunch of kind of little tiny shot holes.
Yeah.
And if you get enough of those shot holes, the whole leaf is just kind of shot.
Yeah, it's not getting the energy.
Yeah,
so it's not being able to store up
and so it can really make the plants go downhill, especially when the radishes are little. Those are flea beetles.
Okay.
And radishes are very, very sensitive to that. Flea beetles. And they're a very tiny little black beetle. Again, they're one of those things that seem to be almost invisible unless you kind of catch them in the act, but you see the results of what they're doing. So again, treat with one of those insecticides that we've got on the shelf. And so flea beetles are attacked on those.
Broad spectrum insecticides that we were talking about earlier.
Yep.
Okay.
And the potatoes. It's interesting how some of these vegetables have their own specific thing that attacks them. For example, the cabbage worms attack cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, things in that. But the cabbage worms don't go to potatoes. But potatoes have their own insect. And so the Colorado potato beetle, which is that round, fat beetle with the black and yellow stripes, now that has been around for so long that it has grown resistant to many of the common insecticides. So the malathion, the 7, the 8, they're resistant to that. But spinosad is so new that spinosad is a wonderful product to use on Colorado potato beetles.
Okay.
And so let's see. In the vegetable garden, I believe that that includes most of them. I should mention the squash vine borer. Okay, again, this won't attack the potatoes or the cabbage, but squash has its own set of circumstances. The squash vine borer. So about the end of June or into July, okay, and everything is a little slow this season, so middle of July is about time to treat. So what the squash vine borer does, as the squash vines start to run a little bit, the squash vine borer, which is a beetle, it lays eggs on the stem of the squash. Those eggs hatch into a larvae that tunnels all the way through the stems, and it causes them to collapse. And so it almost looks like they're all wilting because the innards of the stem have all been eaten out. And so use one of our old standard insecticides that we keep on hand and spray about the lower 18 inches of the stem where it comes out of the ground, and about 18 inches, spray that stem well so that when that squash vine borer adult comes along, it'll be killed. It's quite disappointing to lose some of those. And, it's interesting. These are all challenges, but they're things we overcome. And of course, flowers. Watch for grasshoppers in flowers, such as in petunias, marigolds, even in your pots and planters.
Okay.
Middle of summer on, oftentimes the grasshoppers will invade, and they can do a lot of damage. So watch for those. Grasshoppers seem to love petunias. I've noticed them nibbling on those. And apple trees. Now, we've mentioned before in the past spraying for the apple maggot, which is the region's worst apple insect. That is the insect that when we go to harvest the apples, it has caused all those brown streaks through the flesh. And so continue your spraying every 7 to 10 days with malathion, 7, 8, spinosad, any of those. And, of course, no discussion of insects would be complete without slugs.
Yeah.
Are you bothered with slugs in your yard? I know you've got some
from
hosta.
Time to time, yeah, but we don't. Is that what's eating the holes in the hostas usually?
Yeah, usually. Yep. And we don't see the slugs actively eating usually unless you're out there at night with a flashlight, because they do their work at night in the cool of the night when things are nice and moist, maybe some dew. And so if you're seeing holes eaten on your hosta, or especially other shade-loving type things, and the slugs during the day crawl down under the leaves in the shallow soil, or maybe under mulch. If you have mulch, they hide under that. The way I like to tell if slugs are a problem in your garden they'll also attack vegetables too, or your shade-loving perennials, is to lay a board down in the evening. Maybe wet it first. Wet the board underneath, lay the board down, and then in the morning check underneath. The slugs will oftentimes be clinging to the bottom of that board.
Okay.
And there are slug baits. The insecticides that we listed are not effective on slugs. Slugs aren't really an insect. They're, I guess, a mollusk, like a snail, probably, instead of an insect. And so we need to use other products. Garden centers sell slug bait that you can try.
Okay.
Or the have you ever heard about the trays of beer? Shallow trays
yeah.
of beer sunk down in so that slugs could crawl right across the soil surface and down in.
So yeah, it's
that
almost
can
like
be an attractive.
Yeah, they're set up so that it's on surface level basically.
Yep.
So it's just like walking into a lake or something like
Yeah,
that.
exactly. And so that'll attract the slugs. They'll crawl in and drown. Of course, sometimes I wonder maybe slugs will come from miles around.
Just to get the beer?
Just to get some free beer.
Put up some free beer sign for the slugs.
Exactly. And so after the insects, next I suppose we should talk about diseases that happen.
Before we do that, let's take a quick little break, then we'll come back and talk about the diseases that we're facing midsummer.
When you can't make it to City Hall or school board meetings, local journalists from Inforum.com will be there to report the facts and get your questions answered. Local news works for you. Stay up to date at Inforum.com.
All right, we're back and we're talking about our midsummer challenges that we're facing in the gardens. And we just got done talking a lot about insects. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the disease that we're facing, that we're seeing out there.
And of course, diseases are always worse in seasons where we have more moisture, more humidity, things like this. And of course, we've had that. We've had a lot of humidity this spring, early summer, lots of rain. And so diseases are showing up. And of course, one of those is apple scab. The ornamental crab apples around the region have just been almost decimated, I could say, by the apple scab. So what this has done is it has caused a lot of the leaves to turn yellow, brown. Some are losing their leaves already. Apple scab is a fungus type disease that just proliferates when we get all the moisture and humidity that we've had. And it does vary by the cultivar, the named variety of ornamental crabapple you have. And it does affect fruiting type apples too. So if as you're driving around the region, if you see the flowering crab apples looking really, really tough, at this point, when it's progressed that far, there's not much we can do. Fungicides, and of course, this is going to apply to almost all diseases, fungicides are preventative. So for fungal type diseases, if we apply a fungicide at the very earliest sign of a disease, it can help prevent it from spreading to the entire plant. And of course, with apple scab, this year, by the time we saw it, it's, for most of us, just too late to spray a tree. Once the tree is already affected like that, the leaves are all affected with the blight, it's too late. The fungicides aren't curative. They can't revert brown leaves back to green health. And so, for example, on the ornamental crab apples, this disease shouldn't kill them. And when I say shouldn't, if this happens too many years in a row, it's going to deplete the energy of those, and you could start getting more branch dieback. So that's been very common. Another thing very common is iron deficiency. And it's not a disease spread by a fungus or bacteria, but it's still a disorder. And so that kind of fits into the disease category. So iron deficiency, when we get as much rain as we've had, especially on heavy clay soils, and it's been relatively cool, so cool, wet soil, then a lot of plants have problems taking iron up out of the soil. The iron might be there, but the plant just can't use it. Our aronia shrub, I notice, is quite yellow. Many people's roses are more yellow than normal. Maples always seem to struggle with that because they'd have a hard time in our clay soil. So if you're noticing things that are more yellow, trees, shrubs, perennials, the garden centers have iron products, and just follow the label and apply that to your tree or shrub. It'll take a little while. You might not see anything for a week to 2 weeks, but they'll green up.
I've been using the chelated or chelated,
right?
Chelated iron. Mix that up with water. Dig some kind of holes, kind of around they call it the drip line, the perimeter of the tree. And I always thought that was, well, maybe best to use early in spring as the leaves are just budding out, because then the tree will be more thirsty. Will the tree still be drinking up as much of that, or is it kind of too late in the year to be adding this?
If a person didn't apply the iron product earlier, you can still do it. The time, like you said, the time when it's most thirsty and drinking the iron product up is earlier in the season. So, for example, a maple, something that you always seem to have iron problems with, definitely start, as you did, earlier in the season. Middle of the season here, our Aronia shrub didn't show it up earlier, but it kind of showed up in result to just so much wet, cool soil. So I still added the iron.
Okay.
And so we really could throughout the season. It's not going to do any harm.
Right.
So when you notice it, I would. And that brings up an interesting point, too. There are two ways to apply an iron product, and your label will indicate which product it is. You can foliar feed the iron product, meaning you spray it on. Or if it's a small enough shrub, just mix it up in a watering can and water it over. The foliage has the ability to absorb nutrients. The pores, the stomates can soak this up. A foliar application, of course, you can't do that on a big tree, but on a smaller plant, the foliar application is a little quicker. It immediately goes into the leaf, but it doesn't last as long. The iron applied to the root system takes a little longer to go up into the root system and out through the tree, but it does last longer. So many products will say apply it to both the leaves, if you can reach, and also to the root system.
Yeah, and for ours, it's a tree that's kind of it leans over into the backyard, but it's actually outside of the backyard. So I have to kind of go along both sides of the fence. And I will say I've been doing it for now 3 or 4 years. And I do notice now by this time in the year, a lot of times the tree would be yellow, leaves would have been falling, and it's been able to hold on to the leaves. Leaves are maybe a little bit lighter, but they're still there. So that gives me some hope that it's working.
Definitely.
I'm gonna keep doing it annually, but now, maybe I'll do it. Maybe I'll do it now this weekend just to give it another shot of iron.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fun when some of these plants are ailing like that. If there's something we can do to help, it isn't kind of reassuring. Yeah, to get that iron into your plant like that, you're saving your tree. Because if you don't, we could lose trees like that. Iron chlorosis can be very devastating. And another thing I'm seeing a lot is powdery mildew. Now, that's the grayish fungal coating that comes on leaves. And I'm starting to see this on our peonies, peony leaves. I'm starting to see a few little round circles. And so now I want to treat those with a fungicide. Now, I mentioned that fungicides are preventative. Once a peony is totally covered with silver grayish white powdery mildew, there's no going back. Have you ever seen that, John, where a peony severely affected with powdery mildew is just almost silver white?
I haven't seen that yet, but I think I've seen pictures of it, but I just haven't seen it in person.
Yeah, and so of course that can weaken, maybe not kill, but it can weaken a peony. And so now when I'm seeing these first little dots of that powdery, I need to treat it. An easy way to apply a fungicide is, even on a peony plant, just mix it up in a watering can and water it on over the foliage. Now, okay, what type of fungicides? There's a product, an active ingredient, I should say, that's very common in fungicides. And that's a mouthful called chlorothalonil. Chlorothalonil, CHLOR, chlorothalonil. So when you look at the label, that'll oftentimes be down there in fine print. But a lot of the products that you find at the garden center or the hardware store that generically say things like flower and vegetable fungicide, they'll have that active ingredient in.
Okay.
Another one you oftentimes see is daconil, chlorothalonil, the trade name daconil. And so check those. Many of them are also broad spectrum, just the same way insecticides handle a number of different things. The fungicides also, many of those are broad spectrum. They'll handle things like apple scab, powdery mildew, many things. Or another good active ingredient is copper. There are copper fungicides. So check the label always. And
on something like that, so we've got a couple of peonies. If I haven't noticed a powdery mildew, would I still want to do it anyway? Would I still want to do it just because you're talking about that these are these are preventative.
Exactly. And they can sneak up on a person.
So
if you aren't kind of looking at that peony every day, all of a sudden it might get a toehold, the powdery mildew.
Should you go ahead and do that?
I think I probably would.
Okay.
Like I say, I happen to be weeding around mine and saw these little dots of mildew. So that gives me a clue to, get on it. But yeah, I think I would, because it's all about prevention.
Okay.
Now, I teased about tomatoes, blossom end rot on tomatoes.
Breaded.
Yes. And it can be so deceptive when you watch those first tomatoes forming and you're watching it and it's starting to turn red. And sometimes I've gone to look at that tomato and it looks like it's ripe. And then you turn it over and the bottom side is all sunken and brown. It's like, shoot. And so it's called a blossom end rot on tomatoes. It's not a disease caused by a fungus or bacteria, so fungicides aren't gonna work. What happens is the tomato plant isn't able to take calcium up out of the soil, and so it sucks the calcium out of the developing fruit and causes that sunken brown leathery disorder. Okay, so the tricky part is our soils in the upper Midwest are generally plentiful in calcium. So adding a Tums, to the planting hole isn't going to work. Adding eggshells, adding Epsom salt, those things aren't going to work. Adding milk for calcium, those things aren't going to work. We already got enough calcium in the soil, but the problem is the tomato plant isn't taking it up. And what's causing it not to be able to take it up is if the soil gets too dry. If the soil's wet, then it dries